Good evening, everyone. My name is Tal Zeninger. I'm the president of the International Diplomacy Initiative, and I will be your host for today's IDI Global event. Thank you all for joining us. On behalf of IDI, we are very pleased and excited to welcome you to our first event of 2022. We would like to wish you all a fantastic and fruitful new year. Today, we are pleased to host Dr. Ori Goldberg as our speaker for today's event on the topic of the Iran nuclear deal. Dr. Goldberg is an expert on the study of modern Iran and Shi'i revolutionary movements. Dr. Goldberg has lectured and spoken in a broad variety of academic institutions, from Tsinghua University in Beijing to the University of Oslo in Norway. Dr. Goldberg serves as a regular consultant to Israel's government and defense establishment, including organizations such as the Israeli Prime Minister Office and the IDF, as well as a lecturer at the Lauder School of Government Diplomacy and Strategy at Reichman University. Today's lecture will focus on helping to gain a new perspective and understanding on the new Iran deal that is being drafted. Of course, the following geopolitical landscape of the last 4 to 5 years. This deal is bound to be very different from the deal drafted in 2015. Dr. Goldberg will help us to guide us through the different sides to the deal, as well as to give us an introspective look at the global superpowers at play. As always, today's event is of course being broadcasted to all of our global chapters, including Italy, India, Germany, and more. Today's event will be interactive, just like last month's event with Dr. Afterman. Participants are welcome to ask questions at any time and are encouraged to actively participate during Dr. Goldberg's lecture. You can feel free to participate by using the raise hand function on your personal device. This way, Dr. Goldberg will see that you would like to speak and will call on you so that you can participate. Please be respectful and patient, as there are many of you and only one Dr. Goldberg. For any problem or other questions, please feel free to write to one of our staff members using the Zoom chat. After the lecture is over, we'll of course have the option of splitting into breakout rooms so that participants can continue to speak amongst themselves if they like. And with that, I would like to welcome our guest speaker for today, Dr. Ori Goldberg. The stage is yours.
Hello, hi everyone, thank you. I apologize profusely, but I'm recovering from a cold, not COVID, just a cold. And that means that I'm going to cough at times during the lecture. So I apologize if I pop your eardrums. I'll try to mute myself like the cough button they have on the radio. Before I do that, if I fail, then again, I apologize in advance. It's an annoying cough and it gets worse when I talk, but not COVID. Our session today is going to be interactive because I think it's probably the best way to approach the Iran nuclear agreement, or by its official acronym, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that was reached between Iran and the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, that is the United States, China, France, the United Kingdom, and the Russian Federation, and Germany, that is the P5+1. There's some argument about whether this was an agreement or a treaty. It doesn't really matter. And the intricacies of the agreement are many. But I think an interactive session on the agreement is probably best because of what I think is I guess, the one major point that I want to make about the agreement before we launch into a discussion, and I try my best to answer your questions. And that is that this agreement is a political creature, okay? It is not the result of effective coercion. It doesn't come because it is absolutely necessary to curtail, if not to violently halt, Iran's progress towards a nuclear weapon. There's nothing deterministic in the political process that resulted in the JCPOA and may result in either rejoining the JCPOA or that is reaffirming it, or drafting a slightly modified version, or drafting a significantly modified version. This is a political process. Okay? It's not a military process. It's not driven by an utter conviction that unless this agreement comes to fruition, Iran will develop nuclear weapons and will set out to take over the Middle East or destroy Israel. This is a political process that takes place between two political players. Okay, or Iran is a political player, and let's call it the world is another political player. And as such, this is a process that's very much open to just about any change or modification or contextual development you can think of. This isn't a process that's strictly limited by clearly, rigorously defined security concerns or deeply held convictions about ideological poles that will necessitate that Iran has a nuclear weapon or that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. This is a political process. It is constantly in flux. It is a work in progress. It is meant to create a new political order regulating Iran's international status as the Islamic Republic, as that exceptional state that has been frightening the Western world in general and Israel in particular for the 40-odd years since it was founded. And because it's a political process, for me to take you through the agreement step by step and tell you that this clause determines this and this clause determines that, for the conversation to be a conversation about how many centrifuges Iran deploys or what sort of measures should Israel be allowed to utilize in order to stop Iran, all of these questions that are very legal and technical and formal in nature don't really, I think, capture the importance of this agreement and the potential of this agreement, because they're not political, because they're not diplomatic. In Israel, I'm often a part of arguments about precisely such clauses. You know, it says that Iran can't develop this and can't develop that. Is that okay? Should there be a 10-year limit? Should there be a 15-year limit? And I just want to repeat what I've been saying for a few minutes. And that is that I think these questions are less relevant than they might seem. The underlying assumption of such discussions about the number of centrifuges and the location of secret facilities and whatever is that Iran's progress towards a nuclear weapon and Israel's policy or the West's policy with regard to such a nuclear weapon are fixed entities, that they are known in advance. All right, and why are they known in advance? Because those who look to fault Iran will say that Iran is reactionary, fundamentalist, fanatic, call it what you will, and that Iran has embarked on a course of action that is well known in advance and can be absolutely no different than what is already known in advance. And that is, Iran needs a nuclear weapon to dominate the Middle East and ultimately to destroy Israel, and then perhaps to export its Islamic revolution all over the world. Those on the other side will say that Iran cannot trust the West, that all the West wants to do is humiliate Iran, and the West is out to steal Iran's, or to do away with Iran's right to exist. And because that is the case, Iran cannot trust the West, and Iran must refrain from reaching an agreement, and so on and so forth. But the reality of the matter is that neither of these two extremes, at least the way I understand it, is correct. I'll say this again. There's nothing deterministic. There's nothing known in advance about this process. It's a new process. It's a political process. It depends on the complex juggling of interests, long-term, short-term, of political visions, of political feasibility. This isn't about clearly defined ideological commitment. It isn't a zero-sum game. That is, It's not the case that if the West wins, Iran loses and vice versa. Okay. And it isn't some civilizational conflict where radical Islam fights the enlightened West, and the fight is to the death, and only one civilization can win. It's a game that's being played between complicated, smart, capable players. It's a game in which there's a lot at stake. It's a game that can change the status of the Islamic Republic of Iran and bring it into the family of nations. It's a game that has a lot of implications for the future of the Middle East, for potential arms race in the Middle East, for the potential demilitarization or excessive militarization of the Middle East. There's a lot at stake, but the process according to which this is being done is a political process. And I'll be happy to take your questions about the various players that are a part of this process, anything that you might have heard and would like explained about the agreement itself, about Iran, about Israel, about potential war, about potential peace, whatever you'd like to have me address, I'll be happy to do that. I think it's best done in the form of a conversation because I think that the aspects of the agreement and of the policy that are formal, technical, legal, strategic, call them what you will, I think they are less relevant to enhancing our understanding of this agreement and its potential. All right, and that's pretty much all I wanted to say. I think this is a political process. I think it's a diplomatic process. I think that's what's most important about it. And since that is the case, go ahead and start asking questions. All right, I can see the chat and I'll answer them in the order in which they appear. If there are no questions. Oh, okay. You raise your hand and the hosts will let you just ask the question.
If there are any questions.
And if there aren't, yeah, go ahead.
I think you can just unmute yourself and speak.
Yeah. By all means.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
My name is Benaf Abdurrahman. I'm an international studies student at the American University of Kurdistan. So regarding to the topic, we held a conference last month ago at our university. We talked about the Iran intention of getting the nuclear weapons. Regarding to that, so my question will be, what will happen to the formula of the balance of power if Iran gets their own nuclear program or weapons? And what will be the future of the Israeli and Iranian relationship, especially into the US perspective? And that will be it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Binaf. That's a very good question. One of the $64,000 questions, what happens if? And I'm starting out by saying, by providing the traditional but necessary disclaimer that I'm sharing my understanding of the situation, okay? I'm sure there are people who understand differently. And if one of you considers the situation differently or has heard somebody express an opinion that's very much in contrast to my own, please feel free to bring it up and I'll be happy to address any sort of critique you might have. But in my answer to your question, Pinav, is that I'm not sure a whole lot will happen. I don't think Iran wants a nuclear weapon. I think Iran wants a nuclear program. I think it wants the potential to develop nuclear capabilities. I think Iran understands itself as Iran understands its position as a position in which deterrence is absolutely necessary. Iran understands itself to be located in a region that is basically hostile to its national security interests. And it wants a nuclear program as a deterrent. It sees its own foreign policy mostly as defensive. I reject the notion that Iran has embarked on a hegemonic project in which it means to take over the Middle East. I don't think that's the case at all. I think Iran understands its regional presence mostly as a defensive tool, as a proactive defensive tool. And I think Iran wants its nuclear potential both as a deterrent and also as a symbol of the respect that Iran feels it is owed by Middle Eastern countries and by the world at large. The Islamic Republic has been a pariah state for a long time, even though it has managed to stay afloat economically. Iran sees itself as a regional power. It sees itself as a nation that deserves a seat at the adults' table, not as somebody who's constantly excluded and not consulted, not a part of the significant processes that are taking place in the Middle East, in Western Asia, and everywhere Iran has a presence. Iran wants to get back. Iran sees the nuclear program and its possession of a nuclear program as a means for getting back its place at the adults' table. And because of that, I don't know necessarily that a great deal will happen. People who are afraid of an Iranian nuclear program talk about necessary, unavoidable arms race, one in which Saudi Arabia will want the bomb. Other countries will invest a lot of effort because they will fear Iranian aggression. My understanding of Iranian policy is that Iran often tries hard to refrain from engaging in brute aggression, that Iran is after influence and not after clear-cut military or political decisions. And as such, I'm not sure that an Iranian nuclear program will necessarily destabilize the area or throw it into some state of turbulence. With regard to Israel and the United States, I think the United States is making it perfectly clear that it doesn't have a problem with an Iranian nuclear program, as long as Iran abides by the agreement that was reached, the JCPOA. I think the general American policy is exactly as it was when the Obama administration signed the agreement in 2015. I think the Biden administration is trying to look at Trump's unilateral withdrawal from the agreement as an aberration, as an anomaly. I don't think the United States has any vested interest in forcing Iran to do anything but rejoin the nuclear agreement. That's a major issue, because for a lot of countries in the region, the real problem with Iran is not the nuclear program. It's Iran's regional presence and political involvement in regional squabbles. I don't think the United States considers itself in a position to tell Iran what to do in the Middle East. So I think the US is very much in favor of reforging the original agreement or something close to it. I think Israel invested a lot of time and effort in rejecting the agreement and trying to persuade prominent voices in the United States, ultimately succeeding, to reject the agreement. I think Israel is very much invested in the need to prove that Iran is an irresponsible partner, that Iran should not be accepted back into the fold of the international community, that Iran is a threat to Middle Eastern peace. If the United States and Iran manage to resolve their differences and reach an agreement, Israel will have suffered a setback in its regional and international stature. The reason for that, again, is that our former Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, invested all of his effort and all of his energy in combating the Iran deal, the Iran agreement. He succeeded with President Trump. He won himself a lot of bad faith in the American administration and around the world. And that bad faith is coming home to roost for Israelis right now. So Iran wants an agreement. Iran doesn't really have a way forward other than an agreement. The US wants an agreement. Why does it want an agreement? Because it feels like an agreement would stabilize the Middle East, not destabilize it. And the US doesn't want to be troubled with the Middle East so much anymore. Israel really doesn't want an agreement, but it seems like it'll be forced to accept one. Long answer, but hopefully exhaustive. More questions? Go ahead. Yes. Hugo.
Hello, my name is Hugo. I'm from Paris, France. I wanted to know if you think that the United States may find any advantages in reviving the JCPOA, and if they might even seriously try to do it? And also, what is your point of view on the efforts made by the European Union during the Trump presidency, and as well as their current efforts in Vienna?
Okay, so first, yes, I think the US will find a lot of advantages in reviving the JCPOA. I think it is within America's national security interests as currently defined by the Biden administration. Why? For the reason I started discussing just a moment ago. The US does not want to be invested in the Middle East as much as it is invested currently. The US would like a regulatory framework of which Iran is a member, because then the US will be able to consider the Middle East relatively stable, okay, or stable enough to start considering some American withdrawal as America prepares for its next global confrontation with China. The Middle East is a hindrance to American efforts at such preparation. So the JCPOA would, as far as America is concerned, bring a blessed degree of stability to the region, because it would, how should we call it, de-vilify Iran. It will bring Iran into an organized fold, and it will take a lot away from Iran's renegade status at the moment. And once there is no longer a renegade, once Middle Eastern countries are forced to talk it out rather than fight it out, the United States will feel more at ease with diverting a great deal of its power towards Asia vis-a-vis China. Regarding the European position, the Iranians are very much disappointed with the Europeans. They feel that the Europeans were weak. I mean, you have to remember that the JCPOA was never canceled. The original agreement from 2015 is still here with us, right? We're still a part of it. The United States withdrew from it unilaterally, and the Europeans claimed that they would be able to establish a mechanism that would allow Iran to deal with the consequences of American withdrawal. The European mechanism failed. Okay, Iran's economic ability to overcome sanctions and to remain, again, economically afloat has to do with Iranian ingenuity and with cooperation that Iran received from India, China, and Russia, who kept buying Iranian oil. Europe failed the Iranians. And while the Iranians appreciate the European position in principle against the United States, they are somewhat suspicious of Europe's capability to actually help them along in this process of rejoining the agreement and establishing all the economic ties that the Iranians aspire to when the original agreement was signed. Okay, so Europe has a lot to prove as far as Iran is concerned, but the Iranians are certainly eager to negotiate with the Europeans. They understand that the Europeans stood by them, even if only symbolically, during the Trump administration, and they are eager to start working meaningfully with Europe. They are a bit mistrustful, but that is understood and to be expected. Okay, I answer your question?
Thank you very much.
Sure, my pleasure. Bring them on, people. Ask me some more things. It doesn't have to be strictly about the agreement. You're welcome to ask me about the Islamic Republic. You're welcome to ask me about Iranian politics and Iranian ideology. You're very welcome to ask me about Israeli politics with regard to Iran and generally. Go ahead.
I have a question. My name
Sure.
is Rachel. My name is Rachel Wallace. I'm a MA government student at IDC, now Reichman. I recently read that the UAE actually suspended its deal to purchase F-35s from the United States. So I'm curious, do you think, given maybe how they perceive Iran's role in the Middle East region, do you see them trying to purchase weapons from another nation? And do you, and what do you see as the future now of the Abraham Accords, since that piece of the deal may be unraveling? And by piece of the deal, I mean the weapons specifically.
Yeah, I understand the weapon issue is complicated. I don't know that any one party suspended the deal or did something clear cut to abrogate the deal or whatever, but I'm sure you know more than I do, and I'm not joking. I don't follow the news on that so closely. I don't think the Abraham Accords will suffer as a result. I think that the Abraham Accords were full of sweeteners, such deals that made it easier to sign the accord. I think that with the UAE, the understandings that Israel reached are beneficial to both sides. I think that the broad, long-term, but also the narrow and short-term political interests of both the United Arab Emirates and Israel are served with this agreement. I think the UAE is very adept at navigating its course through the rocky, shoalful waters of the Middle East. Remember that the UAE is Iran's largest trading partner, at the same time that it is talking about Iranian hostility and preparing itself for potential conflict with Iran. Remember that Iranian anger or Iranian proxy anger has not been directed at the UAE, it's been directed at Saudi Arabia, and that is not accidental. Iran's relationship with the UAE is important and meaningful to the Iranians. So I don't think the Abraham Accords will suffer. I think Mohammed bin Zayed, officially the heir to the Emirati throne, but effectively the ruler of the country, is a very, very smart, very calculated man. I think he wants to keep everybody happy in order to allow himself to maintain the strategic, political, economic independence of the UAE to the greatest extent that he can. I think that is the ultimate interest of the family that is ruling the Emirates right now. And I think the Emirates have a lot to gain from the respectability that the Abraham Accord with Israel brought them. The F-35 deal is important, but it's not a deal breaker. And again, I'm not, as far as I know, it hasn't been decided just yet. There's no doubt that the initial deal was reached in a way that does not sit well with the accepted norms of the American administration. So the American administration was a little suspicious. I mean, the Trump administration pulled a lot of quick, silent, fast ones under the nose of US regulatory authorities. But as far as I understand, the deal may actually go through. And again, this is a political process. It's not as though if the UAE doesn't have these F-35s, then it will fall before an Iranian offensive. It's an important deal. There's a lot of money involved, but this isn't what will secure the UAE. And also, again, remember, we're talking about the UAE's fear of Iranian aggression, but we're also talking about two countries that are either the largest or the second largest trading partner for each other. So this isn't a war that's going to happen now, right? Was that an answer to your question, Rachel?
Yes, thank you.
Sure, my pleasure. Go ahead. Yes. I see a hand raised here. Hi.
I'm Amelia. I'm also a government student at Reichman. I was hoping that you could speak a bit about public opinion within Iran about the JCPOA.
That's a good question because there's also a historical element involved here. When the JCPOA was concluded, when it was signed in 2015, Iran was in a little bit of a different place than it is right now. In 2015, there was a heated struggle within the Iranian leadership. The struggle between the words that they use to describe themselves are republicans and revolutionaries. And it's a struggle that characterizes every revolutionary political phenomenon, every revolutionary movement. After the revolution succeeds, there's always a dilemma. Where does the strength of the revolutionary movement lie? Does it lie in revolution? That is, in maintaining a revolutionary attitude with inside and outside towards the world at large, that is hostile, suspicious, seeking potential confrontation, feeling comfortable with constant friction, or once the revolution has succeeded, should the revolution's course turn towards what's called routinization in the literature, normalization and routinization? Should the revolution strive for an anti-revolution, okay, for stabilization? That was a struggle that was raging in Iran in 2015. The Republican wing, that is the people who wanted to stabilize the revolution, they were led by then President Hassan Rouhani, and reaching the JCPOA was their biggest achievement, because what they could offer Iranians was re-entry into the global community, right? That was the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And they managed to sign the agreement. They managed to convince the supreme leader of Iran, who is not a Republican at heart, who's more of a revolutionary than a Republican. They managed to convince him that there's no other choice. He gave his approval. The agreement was signed. Until Trump's unilateral withdrawal, the agreement stuttered, okay? Because the political future in the United States was unclear, many global firms and banks were very fearful about making investments in Iran. The promised economic improvement did not materialize. And then Trump came to power and withdrew from the agreement. So generally, Iran has shifted to more towards, at least rhetorically and publicly, more towards the revolutionary position. That is, not to trust the world, not to trust the United States, not to have faith in Europe. But while that is true politically, and it is, I mean, Iran's president right now represents the revolutionary wing much more than the Republican wing. But while that is true, it is still very clear to Iranians, both to the leadership and to the general population, that Iran's only way forward is through an agreement. That Iran cannot, and should not strive towards a situation where there's no agreement. And this is despite very passionate rhetoric about Iran's abilities to go it alone, to maintain a resistance economy, a revolutionary effort. The Iranian population supports an agreement. It wants Iran to re-enter the world. It wants better living conditions. That population is also tremendously patriotic and is quite happy to rally around the flag of the Islamic Republic in opposition to what they consider and rightfully so, America's unilateral steps. It's complicated, right? They want an agreement, but they want the respect they feel they deserve. They want the agreement to be reached in a way that broadcasts clearly that Iran is a valued, appreciated partner. Okay, and this is not the general public. The conservative somewhat revolutionary president right now, Ebrahim Raisi, I've heard talk in Iran over the last few weeks that just as only Nixon could go to China and only Begin could sign the Camp David Accords, peace between Israel and Egypt, so it is that the liberal Rouhani could not bring the JCPOA to fruition, but the conservative Raisi can. That if this is an effort that is led by, let's call it the right, then it will gain more popular approval. It will be seen as something that is worthwhile and that has potential longevity, where should it have been reached by liberals, it would have been seen as kowtowing to Western interests. Okay, that's sort of an answer, Amelia?
Thank you.
Wonderful, my pleasure. Go ahead. Binad, is that another question you got there?
Yeah, sir. I want to add another question regarding to the Iran's current situation. So after the 1978 especially after the Iran Islamic Revolution. We saw there have been many humanitarian violations by the government towards their people. So despite of the international interference inside their situations, can we say that the Iran population will rise against their government, their current government, in order to build another diplomatic one? It's like, can we say another scenario like Iraq will happen to Iran, maybe, especially during the 2003?
Yes, good question.
Sorry, sir. Another question is, especially because Iran are seeking for getting the nuclear power, what will be the perspective of the other Gulf and Arabic countries like Saudi Arabia? Because when I meet another person, his name was Ambassador Peter Gabriel, he said that if Iran get their nuclear weapons, it might be the other countries to get their own nuclear power, like Saudi will raise money in order to have nuclear, or even Emirat will do the same, and etc., which will lead to a chaotic situation inside the Middle East. So, do you agree to that statement as well?
Going back to what I started out saying, I don't think this is a predetermined affair. I don't think there's anything deterministic about an arms race. I think it's logical that if Iran has nuclear weapons, then or a nuclear program, then the Saudis will want a nuclear program. I don't think it'll be necessarily very easy for them to get one, but I don't necessarily think that a Saudi nuclear program will throw the region into chaos. I don't think that's the case. I think, by the way, I think the original destabilizer is the Israeli nuclear program, and that's been in place since the 1950s. And Israel has, according to most experts, a nuclear arsenal that involves hundreds of nuclear weapons ready for use from various platforms, including submarines and jets and missiles that can be launched from Israel. So you got to remember that as well. I think the JCPOA very specifically says that its main goal is to ensure that Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. Okay, that's stated directly in the JCPOA. It's a commitment made by all the member parties where Iran explicitly gave up on the possibility of a nuclear weapon. Does that mean that Iranians will never strive to have one? Not necessarily, but most likely what they will want to show is that they have the potential for acquiring one should they want one. Israel says, if Iran has the potential, Iran will use it. There's absolutely no other choice. Iran will utilize, will fulfill that potential, and will make a conscious effort to get a nuclear weapon. I think that's a misguided view. I think that ascribes a fanatic conviction to Iranian policy that I believe is missing from Iran's policy. I think that Iran is perfectly capable of making the decision to remain to possess the potential to acquire a nuclear weapon, but not to conduct public tests that will demonstrate that it has such a weapon, to keep it constantly on the threshold, be what's called the threshold state. I think the Iranians are capable of making the political decision to do so. And I think that my interpretation is supported by the fact that the Iranians were capable of making the political decision to sign the original JCPOA. And I put it to you, and this I know, that all the major intelligence organizations in the world, including Israel's Mossad, verified that Iran lived up to all of its commitments under the JCPOA before the American withdrawal. Okay, so if the Iranians can do that, then they can also make a decision not to acquire a weapon. What happens then? Who knows? Maybe Saudi has a civil nuclear program as well. But after all that, I want to say another thing, and that is that even the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia is more political and less deterministic than you might assume. Okay, the Sunni-Shia conflict that's being spun by the Saudis and the American right as the engine that drives this conflict, that's mostly spin. Not that there isn't tension between Sunnis and Shia, but it is not cause for all-out war, for prolonged conflict like Iran and Saudi are experiencing. And also, Iranian-Saudi relations are cyclical. They seem often to be completely deteriorated and almost non-existent, but it has never been the case that Iran and Saudi resorted to open hostilities. They always talk, they always manage to patch things up, even if temporarily, and they're both parties to a dance that, as far as I can understand, will effectively never end. Neither side is interested in doing away with the other. Both sides fully accept the presence of the other as an essential aspect of their regional existence. All right? Okay. More. Go ahead, hit me. You still have me for, I don't know, 20 minutes? Yes, Merdad, go ahead. I see your hand raised.
Yes, hello. My name is Mehrdad. I'm originally Iranian and studying at the University of Bologna in International Relations. And my final master's degree thesis is about the JCPOA. So I will ask this question, which I will also mention in my thesis. So as you mentioned, Iran is not pursuing to develop the bomb itself. Yet the Islamic Republic, I think, holds in one hand nuclear science, and in the other, its ballistic missile program. And to me, it seems this strategy could provide for Iran the deterrence it desires. So do you think this strategy could be a revolution in proliferation? And if it is, then could it lead to perhaps security dilemma in the region, as other states like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, or the UAE would want to follow such a deterrence strategy against the Islamic Republic? In this case, could it lead to increased tensions, arms race, or, as I mentioned, the security dilemma? Thank you.
Sure, very good question. Thank you for that question. What you're basically saying is that Iran, for those of you who are not well versed in details, that for Iran, it's not just about a nuclear program. It's a two-pronged deterrent. It involves nuclear program and its ballistic missiles, and that this offers Iran a unique status in the region and would potentially, if allowed to continue, encourage other countries to follow along that route, to develop such two-pronged deterrent strategies, maybe not exactly that, but something along those lines of their own. That's a possibility. It's a possibility. The logic behind the signing of the JCPOA was that the JCPOA would make it less desirable for Iran to highlight its deterrence and to use its deterrence in a proactive, somewhat hostile way. Okay, Iran's defense would not have to be proactive. Iran would get both goodwill and tangible benefits from accepting the regulatory framework of the JCPOA. And that acceptance would lead Iran to basically accept the rules, okay, play by the rules, to voluntarily relinquish its renegade stance. That is still the logic behind the desire to re-enter or to reforge, to revive the JCPOA. The notion that that is the path that Iran will choose because it chose it once in 2015. And it chose it because it had very good reasons to do so, because they were both domestic and regional. The Islamic Republic understood that in order to ensure its citizens' potential loyalty, it must improve the life of the citizens. It must divert more funds into the Islamic Republic itself and make life better and encourage the creation of the middle class. Or there is a middle class, but encourage its growth, encourage its potential to thrive, and to make the Iranian economy more transparent and more in sync with the global economy. And that was what was on the table when the JCPOA was signed. Those needs have not changed. Despite the fact that Iran is now under revolutionary leadership, conservative leadership, call it what you will, the Iranian agenda has actually remained quite stable. The Islamic Republic understands fully, the leadership of the Islamic Republic, that it must sustain the faith that its citizens / subjects have in the Islamic Republic. Anybody who knows Iranian history, and Mehrdad, I'm sure you do, knows that the revolution of 1979 was the fourth popular revolution in less than 100 years. Even if Iran has never been a functioning democracy, no Iranian leader, dictatorial as he may be, ignores the public unless he does so at his own peril. Even though there is no open, fully democratic system of representation in Iran, the public will, public opinion, public grievances are very much on the minds of leadership. And it is very clear to the leadership that unless they manage to bring Iran into the world, as a part of the international community, to open up opportunities to Iran's millions and millions of smart, educated young people who are very eager to rejoin the world. If the Islamic Republic fails to do that, the Islamic Republic will disappear down the waste bin of history. Right? So I'm actually quite confident that Iran has much to gain from signing the new JCPOA and from being a part of it, just as it had much to gain in 2015, even if political circumstances have changed. That an answer to your question, Mehrdad?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Sure, my pleasure. Nicholas, go ahead.
Yes, good evening. Thank you for the lecture. I would like to ask a question that aims at the interplay between nuclear and conventional deterrence. So this question is still hypothetical, but it should soon become reality. So right now, Iranian deterrence mainly relies on its own militia, missile forces, and those of militias such as Hezbollah. So I'd like to ask if you see any prospects of a diminished Iranian dependency on conventional deterrence by missile forces once it has obtained nuclear weapons and thus nuclear deterrence.
Thank you for that question. It's a good question. I think it reflects an understanding of the complexity of Iranian policy and Iranian politics. Do I think Iranians would be willing to negotiate about their ballistic missile capabilities and capacities? Iran's invested a lot of effort in its missile capabilities. The New Yorker just published an article by Robin Wright, a journalist who's been covering Iran for a long time. Wright was taken into the confidences of the General Frank McKenzie, the commander of America's Central Command that covers the Middle East, and she revealed a lot of very troubling information on Iranian missile cities, on capabilities that are tremendous, on Iran possessing many more missiles than Israel and the US can intercept, and generally on the fact that it's not the nuclear stuff, it's the missile stuff. Now you can bet that Robin Wright didn't just receive access to all this information by accident. That is what the administration is trying to push. The administration is trying to say, let's resolve the nuclear issue, let's sign the JCPOA, and then let's get serious about Iran's ballistic missiles. Do I think Iran is capable of negotiating about its ballistic missiles? Yes, I think it is. I'm not sure that it will, but I think that it is. I think Iranians see their influence on the ground, their presence throughout the Middle East, their proxy presence, if you will, as crucially more important to Iran's national security than the missiles. Iranians generally don't trust technology. They've had 40 years of a pretty intense embargo to encourage their mistrust of technology. right? They don't want to be dependent on any single supplier of anything. And they've spent these 40 years developing very powerful networks of influence throughout the region. I think it would be much, much more difficult for the Iranians to commit to the self-imposition of limits on their regional activity than it would for them to agree on some sort of ballistic missile agreement, certainly not a cancellation of their program, but some willfully accepted limitations on proliferation. So I think that's a real possibility if they feel like they're given the respect that they wanted on the nuclear issue. Did I answer your question, Nicholas?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Good, my pleasure. Hugo, you had a follow-up?
Yes, I have another question. I wanted to know if you think that the attempts of a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran in Iraq through dialogue have any chances of success?
They do, but look, listen, Saudi Arabia and Iran will never be the best of friends. But just as I said before, there's an issue here, okay? And the issue is that both Saudi Arabia and Iran fully acknowledge that neither state is going to disappear, even if the other one really wants it to. Okay, the Saudis and the Iranians are fully aware of the fact that they will continue to trouble each other and to test each other's limits and to provoke each other and to poke each other, but that neither country is ever going to get rid of the other. That seems trivial when I put it that way. It's not trivial at all. Israel, for example, is still operating under the assumption that it can neutralize Iran to such a degree, either by a direct strike or by applying political pressure, that Iran will no longer play a part in regional politics and will consciously, willingly give up its influence. I don't think that can happen. And I think the Iranians and the Saudis have a much more realistic approach towards each other. They know that they will always be talking, they will always be prodding each other, they will always be looking for opportunities to capitalize on each other's mistakes, but that they will also never engage in a war or in prolonged hostilities, the point of which is for one side to do away with the other. Neither side will do away with the other. Okay, it seems trivial, but it's not trivial at all. And they know it full well. All this talk about Iranian hegemony and especially the Sunnis is very often respectable for not never ending, but for a conflict that has to end with one side surrendering. I don't think that's ever going to happen. Okay. Okay. More questions? We still have some time, right?
We have one more last question. Someone sent me a question as well. So one last question and then we'll finish.
Sure. Tamir. Go ahead, Tamir.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tamir from Honduras. Thank you for the lecture. I have a question question about the resources where we can find more information about it, because I've come across a lot of news outlets that are a little bit biased or misleading. So do you have a specific one or various sources where we can find more about the topic in an objective manner?
Hey, that's a great question for me to end on, because it reinforces my initial point. When it comes to the process vis-a-vis Iran, the political process with Iran, I don't think you'll find anyone who everybody will accept as an honest broker or an honest mediator, because it's a political process, because political agendas are of importance when defining one's position or stance with regard to this issue. If you read The Guardian, for example, in the UK, you will find, what I think is very balanced reporting, and certainly the overall tone will be pro-agreement, pro engagement with Iran. If you read the Daily Mail or the Daily Telegraph, and you will find scathing editorials talking about the moral degeneration that leads to negotiations with the Iranians, and how this is proof of the weakness of Britain, and how radical Islam should be made to learn a lesson. So I guess the best advice I can give you is try and read a little bit of everything, and be constantly aware of the fact that if there is such a thing as political truth, and that truth lies somewhere in the middle, with a clear leaning towards diplomacy rather than war. Okay, those who call for war at any price, those who call for bringing Iran to its knees, as far as I'm concerned, they are the real fanatics here. There are a lot of people who talk about limitations that need to be imposed on Iran, who see Iran as a potential threat to regional stability. I can understand that. As long as those people are not calling for regime change or for the instigation of some sort of violent strike on Iran, a direct strike, and I think they are legitimate interpreters, even if I don't agree with them. So again, my advice to you, read a little bit of everything. There's bias, everybody's biased here. That is the nature of a political process. Right? Nobody is completely neutral. All right. Do we have time for another one? Or are we good?
Depends on you. We have 2 more questions that people asked us on the chat.
Sure.
So,
I'm here. I don't have anything better to do. Go ahead.
okay, so the first question is from Laila from United States, originally from Iran. How possible is that the next US president won't leave the agreement if it takes place in Vienna? So, yes.
Oh, that's an interesting question. But I mean, politically, I don't think that any American president has an interest in ditching the agreement. I think the Americans want a signed agreement, and they want an agreement that will allow them to calmly begin to consider the redeployment of military forces in the region and their direction towards Asia. It's true that it is impossible, and I know that Iranians are concerned about this, it's almost impossible to get a guarantee that any future American president will never, ever leave the agreement. Why? Because of the complexities of the American legal and political system. The president cannot give such a guarantee. That's not the way it's done in America. But there can, a lot of incentives can be put in place to ensure that should America leave, it will not be as detrimental to Iran as Trump's withdrawal, and that Iran will have legitimate standing to pursue the agreement, even if an American president finds himself forced to leave. The general sense of things, as far as I understand it in America, from what I'm reading in opinion polls, is that there is real support across the board for an agreement by Americans. This includes Republicans as well. The dyed-in-the-wool Trump base, the hardcore Trumpists, even they are not opposed to an agreement. Again, because remember what Trump promised his base. Trump promised an America that would not fight global wars. Okay, and an agreement with Iran that says Iran will not pursue nuclear weapons for 10 or 15 years. Iran will do this and that to ensure stability. That's something that even Trump can sell to his followers. And also remember that just before Trump withdrew, when Trump became president, he said, I'm going to reach a deal with the Iranians. We're going to solve this in a day. Trump is pro-deal. The fact that he co-opted the anti-Muslim, anti-Iranian agenda and was helped along by Israel, who's also anti-Iranian, that is because of his political exigencies, not because of firm belief in the need to reject an Iran deal. Okay? Second question.
I think Leila wants to do a follow-up.
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Leila.
Yes, hi. Thank you very much for answering my question. Then the main reason that Iranians want to have this deal is because of the economic
Sure.
basically leverage that they can have. But then if they are not sure if the next president is going to stay in the deal, not Iranian, but the big business companies. So they don't want to do the business with Iran. So that is not any good for Iranians if they enter the deal. So how they can be sure that big companies will do business in Iran after the deal is signed, hopefully in Vienna?
You're asking a very, very important question, perhaps the most important question as far as Iran is concerned. And the answer is they can't. They can't. They can't ever have full ironclad guarantees this will happen. But because this is a political process, okay? Because this is mostly, I think, inspired by political will and political leadership, I am as certain as I can be that if the American leadership reaches an agreement and places its political clout behind the agreement, I think that that American companies and global companies will follow. It will take some time, but if the Biden administration demonstrates its commitment to this agreement, I think it's politics first, economics later. Why? Because this is a political thing. It's not an economic thing. The companies want political assurance. They want political commitment. They want to feel sure that this is actually going to happen. If the Biden administration manages to do that, I think the companies will follow. Iran is a bonanza. Iran is a market that all of these companies are very, very eager to open, both in terms of its purchasing power and its infrastructure and the quality of Iranian personnel. Everybody wants Iran to rejoin the world. What they need is proof of political commitment. So I think politics first, money later.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, so the last question, if anyone says a question, they can ask, but this is the last question. From Jeremy from Reichman University, to what extent are young people putting pressure on the government in Iran?
Not so much. Iran doesn't have a credible opposition movement at the moment. And if there are any New Yorkers in the audience, I think it's an amusing analogy. The attitude that most Iranians have towards the Islamic Republic, as far as I know, and of course there isn't 100% reliable information, but as far as I know, the attitude most Iranians have towards the Islamic Republic is a little bit like the attitude New Yorkers have towards their mayors, regardless of their parties. There's one thing all New Yorkers can agree on, is that the current mayor is always the worst mayor in the history of New York City. They voted for him, but he's still the worst mayor in the history of New York City. New Yorkers hate their mayoral administration. It's somewhat like that in Iran. Iranians are not fans of the Islamic Republic. They don't necessarily approve of it. A lot of them feel like the mullahs, the akhunds, the ayatollahs hijacked a popular revolution that happened in 1979, which wasn't Islamic to begin with. They don't like the dictatorship. They'd like Iran to move past its Islamic Republic stage. Still, there is no credible opposition movement in Iran that is seen as a real threat to the Islamic Republic. There are all sorts of efforts. They have not yet managed to cohere into a single movement. And in Iran, that is a significant thing. Why? Because Iran has a tradition of popular revolutions. When do popular revolutions occur in Iran? When the revolutionary movement is a coalition movement, when it manages to bring together diverse interests directed at a single effort, which is overthrowing the government. That has not happened in Iran for more than 40 years. It's not just because the Islamic Republic is a vicious dictatorship. It's because the Islamic Republic is quite savvy at appeasing enough factions within the population to ensure that such a revolutionary coalition cannot be created. Right? The Islamic Republic is, again, often disliked, sometimes vehemently, but generally accepted as the least of all evils. Iranians look around the Middle East, they see a region decimated by the Arab Spring, by civil war, and a lot of them think, we don't like these akhunds, which is the Persian word for clerics. It's a derogatory term. We don't like these akhunds who are in power, but they are at least a devil that we know. So young people are not big fans of the government. They don't appreciate living under the totalitarian system of the Islamic Republic, they are not at the moment applying a level of pressure that is sufficient to even, significantly undermine the government's effort. Okay? All right.
Great. So if there are no more questions, I think we'll do the closing remarks. So thank you so much, everyone who participated. And of course, we would like to thank personally Dr. Goldberg. Thank you for coming and speaking with us today. It was an honor hearing your personal insights and as well as the interesting way to go into 2022. The event